Tonight we present
Heisenberg's experiment. In the early hours of May 1927, the University of Göttingen was quiet, as was typical in the city, except for the low hum of the equipment in the physics department. The air was thick with a sense of mystery, one that had emerged after the most recent experiment involving Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle had taken an unexpected turn. The laboratory, normally a place of logical rigor, was now filled with an unsettling atmosphere. It was here, in this very building, that the boundaries of human knowledge had been stretched further than ever before. Heisenberg, one of the leading figures of quantum mechanics, had long been attempting to understand the fundamental behaviors of particles, especially their inherent uncertainty. It was a breakthrough that had already challenged the Newtonian worldview, but now, a new anomaly was threatening to disturb everything they thought they knew about the universe. The uncertainty principle itself had shaken the scientific community to its core. Heisenberg's theory stated that the more precisely the position of a particle was known, the less precisely its momentum could be measured, and vice versa. This strange idea suggested that reality, on the smallest scale, did not behave in the predictable, deterministic ways that classical physics had once proposed. Particles existed in a state of uncertainty until they were observed, a phenomenon that raised troubling questions for Heisenberg himself. But the latest experiment was not about testing the uncertainty principle. No, it was something far stranger. It all began when one of Heisenberg's protégés, Klaus Weber, developed a new method for observing subatomic particles using an innovative apparatus. Weber had been working late into the night, having observed something in the data that shouldn't have been there. The particles, while seemingly behaving as expected, were showing signs of something else, a disturbance in the fundamental laws of physics. Their behavior was becoming erratic, fluctuating between states of existence in ways that defied even Heisenberg's understanding. Weber's journal entry from the night of the event read, "I have seen the particles. They are not behaving as they should. Something is wrong, something beyond the scope of our theories. I fear I may have touched on something much bigger than the uncertainty principle itself." Heisenberg, upon reading these words, grew uneasy. He had trusted Weber with one of the most important experiments in the laboratory, yet he too began to sense that the nature of reality itself was in jeopardy. The following morning, the lab was abuzz with activity, and the mysterious readings from the equipment could not be ignored. The usual team was present, but there was a noticeable change in the mood. Something inexplicable was happening. The experiment was supposed to be simple, but it had revealed an anomaly. There was a gap, a glitch in the data, where the particles did not behave as quantum mechanics predicted. Some observers claimed they had seen an object disappear in plain sight, a phenomenon that could not be accounted for by current scientific knowledge. "Werner, we need to talk," Hans said, breaking Heisenberg's train of thought. He was one of the senior scientists in the lab, and his tone was grave. "Something is wrong with the results. We can't make sense of the readings. It's like the particles, they've disappeared, but there's no sign of them." Heisenberg frowned, looking over the data again. "We've only been measuring the position of the particles. What if the problem lies in their momentum? Or perhaps something more unexpected?" Hans' face was pale. "It's not just that. The particles are vanishing from our observations, but the data suggests they are still there. It's as if they exist in two places at once." Heisenberg rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation starting to sink in. He had worked on the uncertainty principle for years, but this was something far stranger, something that suggested a deeper mystery lying beneath the surface of quantum mechanics. Hours later, the results from the lab's equipment confirmed what Hahn had feared. The readings had become increasingly erratic, with particles seemingly phasing in and out of existence. At times, they would appear as if they were in multiple locations at once, an effect that was eerily similar to the concept of superposition in quantum mechanics, where a particle can exist in a state of multiple possibilities until observed. The more Heisenberg studied the data, the more he became convinced that they were witnessing a phenomenon that went beyond the limitations of their understanding. Perhaps the uncertainty principle wasn't merely about the imprecision of measurement. It could be something far more fundamental. The nature of reality itself might be in flux. What if, Heisenberg muttered to himself, what if the particles aren't just uncertain, but rather, they are transitioning between different states of existence in different realities? Heisenberg's curiosity was piqued. Could it be that the particles were not just uncertain, but existing in multiple dimensions? If particles could exist in superposition, perhaps there was more to the uncertainty principle than he had originally imagined. Could this experiment be providing a glimpse into parallel worlds? Into dimensions that were outside of the one we inhabited? The strange behavior of the particles was becoming increasingly difficult to explain, and there was something more troubling. There had been reports of strange events around the laboratory, things that couldn't be explained by any conventional means. People had seen shadows where there should have been none. Objects were disappearing and reappearing in impossible ways, and there was a sense in the air that something larger was at play. Heisenberg stood in the center of the lab, observing the monitors as they flickered. Something was happening, and it wasn't just a failure of the equipment. The particles were responding to something beyond the physical laws they had always known. Something was leaking into their reality, something that defied explanation. Days passed, and the situation only became more intense. Klaus Weber, who had been at the forefront of the experiment, suddenly vanished without a trace. His disappearance was puzzling. There were no signs of a struggle, and the laboratory was locked from the inside when his colleagues arrived in the morning. His notes were left behind, filled with references to the strange phenomena they had been observing. There were even mentions of other worlds and dimensions shifting, terms that no one had expected to encounter in serious scientific discourse. The disappearance of Weber raised more questions than it answered. It was as if he had simply vanished, as if he had passed into one of the other dimensions his notes had hinted at. Was it possible that the experiments had opened a door to another world? Could Weber have been lost to the very forces they were trying to understand? Rumors began to spread. Some said that the government had taken an interest in the work being done at Göttingen, and that they had been involved in suppressing information about the mysterious experiment. Others believed that the disappearance of Weber wasn't an accident, but a deliberate attempt to silence someone who had gotten too close to the truth. The questions multiplied, but the answers seemed to elude everyone. Meanwhile, the laboratory itself became a place of foreboding. The atmosphere was thick with tension, and the team of scientists who remained began to question their own work. Heisenberg himself was plagued by doubts. He had always been careful with his theories, but now, faced with the unexplained, he wondered if their experiment had unleashed something that humanity wasn't ready to comprehend. That night, Heisenberg stayed late in the laboratory, staring at the data on the monitors. There was no doubt about it. The quantum anomalies were growing stronger. The particles were behaving in ways that shouldn't be possible. And, most disturbingly, there were signs that the door that had been opened was not closing. It was widening. Suddenly, the room's temperature dropped. A cold, almost unnatural chill swept through the laboratory. Heisenberg looked up, his heart racing. In the far corner of the room, a shadow shifted. It wasn't a figure, at least, not in the conventional sense. It was something else, something intangible, something that flickered in and out of existence, like the particles they had been studying. Heisenberg stood frozen, his breath caught in his throat. It wasn't just an anomaly in the data, it was a tangible presence in the room. He had been right. The particles were opening a doorway to something beyond, and whatever it was watching them. The atmosphere in the Göttingen laboratory had become suffocating. The mysterious anomaly that had appeared to them was not merely a theoretical puzzle. It was now a very real and tangible presence, something that could no longer be dismissed as coincidence or error in their instruments. The particles had ceased to behave as they were expected to. The very fabric of reality seemed to be unraveling, or rather, expanding into realms that were impossible to comprehend. Heisenberg stood alone in the lab, his mind racing as the shadow flickered once again in the corner of the room. The coldness that swept over the space was unnerving, but it was not the temperature that froze him. It was the knowledge that the laws of physics, as they had always known them, no longer applied. The quantum anomaly was not just confined to the particles. It had manifested in the very space around him. Heisenberg's breath caught in his throat as he reached for the report Weber had left behind. The young physicist's final notes had become a frantic recounting of his discoveries, written in a barely legible script. The last page, however, was completely blank, except for one cryptic sentence that had been written in the same frantic hand. "They are watching. I can feel them pulling at the edges of my mind. I don't know how much longer I have." The implications of these words struck Heisenberg like a thunderbolt. What had Weber discovered? And who were they? His mind tried to grasp the enormity of the situation, but it was as though the more he thought about it, the less sense it made. The particles, they were acting like ghosts, existing in states that shouldn't be possible, showing signs of what could only be described as interference from another reality. Suddenly, Heisenberg was jolted out of his thoughts by a loud crackling sound coming from the central monitor. The data was shifting erratically. Particles were flickering in and out of existence, and this time, the discrepancy wasn't just a glitch. It was an acceleration of the strange behavior that had been observed earlier. It was as if the very concept of space-time was being bent. Heisenberg quickly ran through the calculations in his mind. He had seen similar patterns in his research, but never in such an extreme form. Quantum mechanics had always hinted at the possibility of multiple dimensions, of superposition and entanglement, but what they were seeing now went far beyond these concepts. What if the particles were no longer just existing in superposition? What if they were existing in multiple dimensions at the same time? Could it be that the uncertainty principle was more than just a limit to our ability to measure? Perhaps it was a doorway to alternate realities, realities that were in constant flux, where time and space were not absolute but rather malleable. Before Heisenberg could process this thought further, the temperature dropped again, this time sharply. The shadow in the corner of the room flickered and began to move toward him. This was no longer a trick of the light. It was something conscious, something aware of its presence in this dimension. Heisenberg's pulse quickened. He could feel his breath grow shallow as his mind raced. The anomalous shadow seemed to take form, though its edges remained undefined. It was as though it was a creature of pure energy, a being from another reality that was stepping through the cracks in the fabric of space-time. Heisenberg instinctively reached for the nearest equipment, an old analog camera, but when he looked back, the shadow was gone, as if it had never been there. But it had been. He had felt it. A soft voice broke through the silence, almost imperceptible. "Werner." Heisenberg spun around, his heart pounding in his chest. There was no one there. But then he remembered the last entry in Weber's notes. "They are watching." "Who are you?" Heisenberg called out into the void, though he knew no one would answer. But the voice came again, clearer this time. "You are too close," it said, "too close to the door." A shiver ran down his spine. Heisenberg understood now. The experiments had opened something they couldn't control. It wasn't just the particles they had been observing that were unstable. It was reality itself. The very act of observing had triggered a breach, a doorway that connected their world to another. Heisenberg spent the following days combing through Weber's notes, searching for any clue that might explain the anomaly they had encountered. But the more he read, the more he became convinced that the young physicist had uncovered something far more profound than a simple error in measurement. It wasn't just an experiment gone wrong. It was a deliberate attempt to manipulate the very fabric of reality. Weber had stumbled upon a hidden truth, one that the higher powers within the scientific community, perhaps even beyond, had tried to suppress. Heisenberg wasn't the only one interested in these findings. There were others, shadowy figures who had been watching from the outside, their motives unclear. What if the government had been involved from the beginning? What if they had known about the risks but had allowed the research to continue, eager to control the power of the anomaly? Heisenberg's thoughts were dark. He had long suspected that science had its darker corners, hidden agendas, secret funding, and political motives. But this was something else entirely. And then, there was Weber's disappearance. It had seemed like an accident at first, but now, Heisenberg wasn't so sure. Had Weber been silenced? Had he uncovered too much? But before Heisenberg could take his suspicions any further, the strange phenomenon that had plagued the laboratory reached its peak. The room grew cold again, and the flickering of the shadow returned. But this time, it wasn't just in the corner of the room, it was everywhere. The very walls seemed to pulse with energy, and the laboratory began to distort, its edges blurring as if it was being pulled apart. Heisenberg felt himself drawn to the center of the room, his body refusing to move as though it was being anchored to this new reality. The voice came once more, but now it was louder, clearer, and more insistent. "You cannot escape. You have opened the door, and now it is open forever." The particles, those strange subatomic entities that had once obeyed the laws of physics, were now completely out of control. They had become conduits for something far more powerful, a force that existed in dimensions beyond their own, and which had no intention of being contained. Heisenberg's mind reeled as he tried to comprehend the magnitude of what was happening. The experiment had not just revealed new quantum phenomena. It had torn a rift in the very nature of reality. What had begun as an effort to understand the subatomic world had turned into a dangerous exploration of the unknown, a breach that could not be undone. As the laboratory began to collapse inwardly, reality itself seemed to warp, and Heisenberg felt himself slipping through the cracks. The particles, now no longer confined to their quantum states, were interacting with him, with everything. Time and space seemed to be spiraling into a singularity. In the laboratory, the world he had known was disintegrating. The last thing Heisenberg remembered was the voice, echoing in his mind, "You have seen too much. There is no turning back now."
The questions don't end here, nor does our pursuit. If this story unveiled something you never expected to discover, then you're in the right place. Remember to subscribe, turn on notifications, and share this tale with others who, like you, are drawn to the unknown. Here, mystery always finds its voice, until we meet again, where the inexplicable will once again serve as our starting point.